Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a real honor to be here. So I look forward to having a chance to visit with people that are interested in Germans from Russia and also in textiles. And so thank you for being here. So I did retire just, I guess it's about 9 months ago, and it feels really good. I recommend it. But I love teaching. You know, I loved students, and so it's really quite interesting to have a chance to visit with people that I'm just going to think of you as students, so, but also scholars in your own right. So thank you very much. And so with the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection, that was around a lot longer than I was at NDSU. I started teaching in 1991 full-time. I taught 3 years part-time prior to that. And right around that time, the person that was the curator of the Emily Reynolds costume collection accepted an administrative responsibility, and so I started volunteering and ended up, a couple years later being called the curator of the Emily Reynolds costume collection. And when I started full-time, the following year, I went on a faculty bus tour led by the president. And one of the people that was invited along for color commentary was Michael Miller. And Michael gave a really interesting history of the area of Ashley and Emmons County and the areas that is kind of part of the German-Russian triangle in North Dakota. And it was fun to learn about the iron crosses that were grave markers in the cemetery, and to meet the people and hear the wonderful accents that people developed. We also went to the Lawrence Welk birthplace, so the band leader in North Dakota. And by the end of the time, he had talked me into starting to collect German-Russian textiles on behalf of the Germans from Russia Heritage Collection, but then house them in the Emily Reynolds collection, because we knew a little bit more about how to take care of them. Textiles are one of those things that if you don't care for them really well, they disappear. And probably some of you have gone back after the summer. All the critters have lived in the summertime, and you have a moth hole in your sweater. Usually what they go after are little spots of food that, so if you look at old sweaters, kind of the direct hit area in front of you is what gets eaten away, or the sleeves, the cuffs or the elbow. And so, cleaning textiles before you store is important. But anyway, it launched my interest in the German from Russia culture, because it's a wonderful group of people that are just so courageous, and I really admire them. And so, anyway, so this is a map that I didn't see this particular one, but I saw two of the others that are part of this set. This is 19th century German villages in South Russia. So this one is a map that looks at the Black Sea area from the Crimea. You can see the peninsula of Crimea on your right, and then it goes down to Romania on your left. And what was so interesting and useful about this, it lists the old German names and the position of them approximately, on the landmass. And it's fun to look at some of the other maps that are on the table. It's a little hard to see the forest through the trees with some of them. So I think the editing, the versions that is on the map is handy because of that. But this map was interesting to just kind of see where the different groups were, to learn about when they arrived in Russia and what kind of invitation they had to make that move, and to consider what life was like. And so one of the things that happened as we started collecting textiles of the Germans from Russia is that we received a lot of flat textiles that were shawls. So both the headscarf and a shoulder scarf, or shoulder shawl. And as you look at a flat textile, it's kind of a head scratch. How did the people wear it? How did they, fasten it around their head or wrap it around their bodies? And so as I was trying to figure out what I should study for my doctoral work, and because you have to kind of buy into something and be willing to commit for about 3 or 4 years or longer before you choose, because you don't want to go away hating it. And so as I was driving and trying to figure out what to do, I thought, learning more about the shawls of the Germans from Russia would be beneficial to the collection, and it would be interesting for others to learn about as well. And so anyway, what my overall question was, is what can be learned about the shawls in relation to women's experience? Because one of the things as we collected the provenance, the background information about the shawls, is that generally they were passed down on the women's side of the family, and that they were tied to women's role within society. And so I thought, this is rather interesting. What else can be learned as well? So that anyway, I'll share some of those things with you. And so Michael was very helpful in putting calls out to people that he knew. He had a very big email list, and he asked for people who had shawls in possession in their family, if they'd be willing to allow me to visit with them and interview them, and then take photos of their textiles and to learn about them. And so there were two families that they were the only women, they were only daughters in the family, I put it that way, and they inherited all their mother's shawls. And so it was really interesting seeing the wardrobe of what they had, and the other things that were in the trunk that they stored them in. Then in Ashley, North Dakota, we went to a senior citizen center, and Leona and I called all of her friends up, because she was really interested in textiles, and she was a good historian, and she was very connected in the community. And we had lunch, because that's what we always do. And then afterwards, I talked about what I was learning and hoping to learn, and then they got up and told about the shawls that they brought in, or other things that they brought in. And then people talked about their memories of how they could remember, Mrs. Schneider continuing to wear a shawl, a headscarf into market until into the 1950s, or they wore them to church, and just on and on. And it was really wonderful to hear that. And so the oral histories and written family histories we dug into. I knew more about textiles than I did about the Germans from Russia culture, and so I had to read a lot. And there's the Salad book in the back, and that was really a wonderful resource. And family histories a lot of times, told about where they were from in Russia, but then also where they lived and what life was like in the United States. And with flat textiles, you wonder, well, how were they worn? And so I looked for photographs as well. And there were two photos that kind of emerged from the families that I was visiting with, and then some others in the Harper's Weekly magazine from 1896. There's an article about German Russians living in Eureka, South Dakota, and it's a market day. I have a picture of that in the slides that I have, that was about it. And so, I'm still on the lookout for pictures like that, just to document that aspect of society. The map that the Germans from Russia Heritage Center has was really useful to kind of plot where the villages were that the people came from originally. And so that offered some meaning as well. All the dust in the air is kind of giving me hay fever. And so with fibers, the things the fibers that were used were wool, and there was a sheep culture there, and flax, and people did grow linen, and they did process it, silk was available. Cotton was something that wasn't grown there, but was imported from India or Egypt or places that had longer growing seasons. With silk, there was a silk industry there, and there was a book from an author, I should have looked back at her name, but she talked about what life was like before they moved here, and they were able to get a little package of silk eggs and then raise those into caterpillars and then moths. And so anyway, they had a sericulture as well. And so it's interesting that everything but cotton was something that was produced in the home economy. At least I found records in many families. With the yarn construction, you can kind of get in the weeds that way too, but you know that sometimes you can have just a singles yarn where all the fibers are just twisted once, but then you can ply a yarn and that makes it stronger. If you think about kitchen string, that's lots of skinny strands together. And so, that might be interesting for somebody that likes textiles, but not really many other people. So I looked at them, are the yarns handmade, or are they machine-made or factory-made? So handmade, if it was made out of wool and there was some thick and thins, and the family had that recollection that the mom or somebody in the family made it, that kind of put it into the hand-spun category. And with the factory spun, things are very uniform, very, very uniform. And so you have very smooth, even-looking yarn structures. And so that was kind of the division that I made there. And then with fabric construction, hand-woven or machine-woven, and we'll talk about that as we look at them more. And then finishing. So with finishing, once you get done with a textile and you take it off the loom, then you have to wash it because it's really loose until you wash it and get it to shrink. And so then you can full it. If it's wool, you can full it and felt it. So that shrinks it even more. Dyeing is something that is a finish as well. Most of the shawls that are shoulder shawls, those were yarn dyed. And so then, interesting designs resulted. And then if you want something soft and fuzzy, like flannel shirts, or maybe a tweed jacket, you brush it. And that's one of the ways you can kind of get rid of a shiny spot on wool, is just to take a vegetable brush and brush it. But that's a finish that's done. And then fringing, adding fringes is another thing. And so those are the things that I kind of picked up on. The sizes, and I apologize for not converting this into centimeters. Is that, do you think in centimeters now? Okay, so you're okay. You're okay with inches. Okay, good. So then you're speaking my language then. And so we have, with woven things, we have things that two different yarns. Yarns that run through the loom, and so the yarns are wound up on a stick that they call a warp beam. Okay, and so that's just threads that are lined up, and they could be 5 yards, it could be 1,000 yards. If it's a machine-made textile, it could be even longer than that. But with the hand-woven textiles, we know that the weft, which is the crosswise, and so the weft, you go back and forth, and then there's a beater bar that you push the yarn into position, and then change the heddle to get the other interlace going. And so with that, if you're hand weaving, your hands, your wingspan is it's a limitation. And so the weft yarns, 24 inches was one of the widths for a shawl that, to me, it kind of looks like a stole, like a mink stole. It's shorter, maybe from the high hip to the shoulders in length, or up to 40, and that would be more for a cold weather shawl, a wider shawl, and bits in between. With the warp for the shoulder shawls, they generally were 6 feet to 7 feet, sometimes a little bit shorter if they shrunk. But that's big enough to wind around the body and then tuck under and hold. And so you could, if a mom was carrying a baby, the baby helped to hold that shawl into place. As we got into factory-made shawls, then we get into 6-foot warp and 6-foot weft, both ways, or even bigger than that. And so, that's because they're able to throw the shuttle with mechanical power back and forth, and so they can have a bigger design area because of that. Then with head shawls, they were smaller and they were thinner fabric, so 30 to 36 inches square, so a yard square, and then bigger with the fringe. And generally there was fringe on 4 sides. I saw at least one shawl. I remember one where it was just fringe on 2 sides, and very worn. So it was interesting to see. So with the next couple of shawls, or slides rather, I will talk about the different shawls and show you pictures of them. And so I divided them up according to hand woven and factory woven. And so we'll see striped shawls and plaid shawls that are hand woven. And then with factory woven, we'll see factory made shawls with a supplementary woven border. Kind of fancy. But anyway, there's a design that goes around the perimeter. And and then there are plaid shawls with fringe. And the fringe is part of the yarn structure of the fabric. It's not added on most of them. And then with the factory woven head shawls, that's another category where I have a couple different variations. But here's an image that shows the bright colors of the striped hand-woven shawls. So beautiful red, bright colors. So bright red, bright blue, real strong shades. And so it's interesting to see how with some of them, like the one that is towards the bottom, there's that big wide blue stripe and then smaller stripes. So there's kind of an irregularity with some of them, but then most of them have a stripe that's broader and then it's divided in the middle by another stripe. And so with this one, with this, excuse me, with this piece, this is the first shawl that was given to the collection. So Vi Schilke gave it to us. And you can see it, what we call a repeat in weaving. And so if you look at the tan stripe, it goes tan red, dark green red, blue red. And so there's a 6-stripe repeat. I'll show you a close-up. And this is a different shawl. But with this one, you can see how intricate the design is that runs in the middle. And so with this particular shawl, that person was very smart and very good at weaving, and they had an ability to kind of pull up a few yarns to get that railroad pattern. Oh, sure. Came to the rescue, thank you.
Sure it's water.
It's water. And this one is from about 1900. The previous one was from 1885. And so, we're seeing things that were from the 1800s, the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is one that comes from Maria's family. And so with this shawl, it has that 6-stripe repeat, but the stripe that divides it, there still is that division, the wide stripe divided by a small stripe, but it has just the color there. It doesn't have that little repeat. And so it's interesting to see how this one was made in 1930. And so there's a lot of time between 1900 and 1885. And Hermina Janner, Maria's family comes from Romania, from Colilia. And so they moved maybe in the mid-1800s, do you think, from the Krasna area to Romania. And so, that's a long time to live and, practice those traditions and kind of interpret them in a way that's efficient and functional for you. And so it's interesting to see the pattern is still similar, but a little bit different. And their family has a wonderful history that has been interesting to learn about. Then here are hand-woven plaid shawls. So still we have almost hurt-your-eye colors, with that red and the green. If you looked at that a while, your combs would blow, and you'd see blue and yellow. And has anybody worked with Christmas red and Christmas green, stitching or quilting? And after a while, you look away, it's like, whoa, big line. But anyway, it's beautiful, it's striking, it's vivid, and you'd see it. And the shawls are, this is really quite beautiful because there's an outline. It's not just red and green, there's a blue, or what would you call it, a red-violet stripe that outlines each of those squares. Then at the bottom, there's a fringe that was added later with the 4-ply yarn like you can buy today. So here's another hand-woven plaid shawl. This has a similar combination in colors. The green is a little less vivid, but it has red and then that red-violet and then a green. And then this one has a crocheted border. And so Leona Nye from Ashley, North Dakota, has this in her collection. And in another collection in California, when they pulled out shawls, I think this one is from California, but another donor on that, or another person that shared information with me, she, in her trunk, had these beautifully hand-drawn graph papers, and perfect graph paper. Usually that's something that's printed, but you could see it was pencil, and at the end of the line, you could see where it came off the paper. And then she would, this one as well as the previous design is filet crochet. I don't know if any of you know that. You create a grid, and so it's very geometric. That graph paper is perfect. So you can create something that has the initials, the monogram on it, or a picture of some sort within it. And she also had hand-carved crochet hooks that were the different sizes according to the yarn. So it was really interesting to see how that was important in part of her toolkit in order to make things for her family. And so with this one is just 2 colors, but it still has a border type thing around the shawl, around the plaid rather. And so the hand-woven plaid shawls and the hand-woven striped shawls, would you agree that they're brightly colored?
Yeah.
And so it's curious to me. In visiting with families and reading about what life was like in Bessarabia and other parts, they talked about how there were peddlers, that one of the things that they would sell was dye stuff. And they would buy little packages of dye. And they came like little rocks, lumps of lignite coal is what they were described as. And so they would have to pulverize it before they would put it in the dye pot, the water to dissolve. So here is the factory-made shawls, and with this one with woven borders. And so this is a shawl from the Rieger, Amalia. Molly Schlittenhart Rieger is the one that donated this to us, and it was her mother-in-law's shawl. And they were from a village that was south and west of Odessa, so outside the Bessarabian area. I can't remember the name of that. Liebenthal, thank you.
Liebenthal, right outside.
Yes. Yes. And so, and then this is from 1908. And she has a sister, Amelia. So Amelia and Amalia were part of the same family. And they could remember their mother talking, and their father rather, talking about how he served in the Russian army and what that was like. And so it's interesting how, with the loss of the privileges in 1874, then men had to start serving in the Russian army as their Russification took place. And so it's interesting that this family, they just had a factory-made shawl. They didn't have the hand-woven shawls. Here's that same shawl. It's opened up. And as you look at it, can you see the little horizontal line where it's worn?
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about looking at a textile is sometimes there's evidence of how it was worn. So this one was always folded before it was put around the body. And so seeing that laying flat, you can see where that line is. The other thing that's interesting is in that picture on your right, the lower right, that's the back side and the front side of a corner of the shawl. And so the back side, where the black is on the front, is that grayish color. And so it's just opposite. And so, it's an interesting structure. And so, anyway, it was one that they could remember when it got really cold in North Dakota. Amalia's mother-in-law would wear a coat, and then the shawl would be put over the top. And so, it's interesting to think about how we still do that today, to try to, stay warm in our bitter winters. This is a shawl that was donated, or that is in the collection of Carol Just, who's a wonderful folklorist and storyteller. And so it's one that came from Kassel in the Blickstall colony in the mid-1880s. So 1885, 86 is when she thinks that the grandparents left. And what's interesting about this is the backside has a little bit different colorway, but not as stark as that previous one. And when I look at that, it has a striping pattern that's similar to those hand-woven shawls. And so I find it interesting to see how that carries on. Here's another one that has a little bit different design. And with this one, it has fringe that is stitched onto it. This one came from I guess Dolores Kettling Hansen is here, and from the Glickstro colony as well. And so this is worn in South Dakota. And so what's interesting about the shawls that I just showed you is that these came from Russia. The families knew they came from Russia. But you could also buy them in the United States. This is a picture from Montgomery Ward. Was that a catalog you got too? Monkey Ward? As a U.S. company. So you had Eaton's? Okay. But you have Sears, that has gone out now. And so we had Sears, Montgomery Wards, and J.C. Penney's that were catalog retailers that developed because of homesteading. All the people were living on the prairie, and they wanted things that were more, that weren't just available in the country store, in their little towns, and so they were able to order them. And so we had the mail service that would bring them, and the railroads helped out with that. And so it's interesting to think about how those tastes that came from Russia were provided for in the United States as well, by the buyers. So factory-made plaid shawls. This is a beautiful shawl that is from about 1914 from Teresa Mackwald. And so with this one, instead of wearing them like a rectangle, it was folded like a triangle and then wrapped around the body. And that was a common way of wearing shawls in the time of Mary Lincoln. I have all these American things. So Abraham Lincoln was 1862, and Mary Lincoln was his wife. And so when I taught costume history, I could find pictures of Mary Lincoln because she was photographed, and there were beautiful etchings of women with great big skirts, bell-shaped skirts, and then a great big shawl, a triangular shawl that was probably knee length and pointed to the center of the leg, at about the knee. And so it was a style that was an elegant but fashionable way of wearing a shawl. And so I have a close-up of this one, and so you can see the bright colors on the top of that shawl, and on the back it was a little bit more muted. And this is a beautiful shawl. It's really, really heavy. And it has a boucle yarn, and it's kind of fuzzy on the top side. And then it is a little bit furry on the back side too, but the more greenish side is the face of the fabric. And so it's really a nice piece. She recalled her family using it as a car blanket. And I still keep a blanket like this in my car, living on the prairie. I have a car that it's 9 years old. It has a good heating system. It's fairly reliable. But I can remember when I was a kid how cold cars were. The heating systems were kind of crappy. And so you had to keep warm and have all those extra blankets and things. So, before we had down jackets and all that extra, polyolefin that helps us keep warm, we put more on, and heavier things were warmer. And so a thicker blanket was a warmer blanket, better for our cold climates. Then here are examples of two others. With the one that's the brownish shade, that was worn by a 14-year-old girl when she traveled with her uncle to America. They moved to South Dakota, and she always wanted to go back to Russia and never did. And so I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. And then the one that is on the right-hand side is one from Lodi, California, when I interviewed Marlene Strand. She was the one that had the crochet hooks and the interesting graph patterns. And her family came from Klostitz in Bessarabia, and they moved to Bodle, South Dakota in, I think it was 1892. And it was really, really cold. And I think they had 2 or 3 children that died there. And they didn't want to stay there, it was too cold. So they moved to Washington State, and then eventually to Lodi, California. And so it was a real gift to see the shawls that she had in her collection. But she also had this triangular shaped shawl, as well as hand-woven shawls, and blankets as well. Then the head shawls, what most people that I interviewed called them were tiple, and I don't have the good hook, so I apologize. But I know that other people call them other things. And tuk was one.
Babushka.
babushka, and that's the Russian. Yeah, but that it comes honestly from where they live. Can you think of other? Kerchief? Okay. Anybody else?
Scarf.
Scarf. Yeah. And so it's interesting to consider. And so what I like about this image, it was shot on a light board, you probably know the name for it, but the light shines from below and it has that nice glow. But it really did a nice job of showing off the fringe. And so the fabric is a very thin wool, or perhaps a wool cotton blend, but generally wool, but really beautiful wool. If you bought it today, it would probably be $40 to $50 a yard, and maybe even more. But anyway, they would put a hem in them, and then they would proceed to add fringe. And do any of you remember macrame?
Oh, yes.
That's essentially what's done here, that the fringe is macrame. And so they would use pins, to pin out the strings and pin the knots in place, so you'd have a nice even knot pattern when you got done. It's a skill. It's interesting when I, try to crochet and do any kind of handwork, knit, crochet, weave. If I'm really tense, you can see it. And when I relax, everything gets big. And so it's interesting that the mastery of the hand and mind, the two together. And so, whoever did the fringe of this one at the bottom, that person was a master. It's a little easier if there's only one or two rows of knots, but even that takes skill. And so with this tradition, it's interesting to see. There's a book that is from McIntosh County that Nina Farley-Wishick wrote, and it's called Along the Trails of Yesteryear, Tales of McIntosh County in Dakota Territory. But anyway, she, Farley is her last name, so she sounds pretty Irish, I would say. But she moved there with her family when she was, teenager, maybe a little bit younger. And she had enough of an education, so she taught school at one-room schoolhouses in America, because you just had to go, I think you had to complete high school to be able to teach grades 1 through 8 in American schools back then. And so she would go and stay with German-Russian families and live, she'd stay and then teach school to the kids down the block. And so she was like a person that was, that studied the German-Russian culture, as she lived there. And she continued living in Ashley, although in the city of Ashley rather than the rural areas, and started writing about what she remembered and what she saw as German-Russian traditions. And she talked about how when she was a school teacher, on Saturdays before church, the mom and the daughters would brush their hair out. They'd take off their scarf, untie the braid, and brush their hair out. And she said that the hair would just kind of go into a halo, a fuzziness. And if it needed like a cream rinse, what we would use as a cream rinse, they would use butter or lard. Could you imagine? But then that would soften it up, and they'd be able to plait it again. And then they'd tie it with twine or string, roll it back into a bun, and in the morning the shawl would go back on. And so that was their hairdressing tradition. And Carol Just is trained as a hairstylist, and she said that the less you wash your hair, the less greasy it gets. Your body stops producing the sebum that coats the hair, makes my bald spot shiny. and so anyway, that they probably didn't have really a lot of grease in their hair. And then they had lye soap that they could make with ashes and rendered lard. And so they had a soap, but think about how harsh that would be. And so that maybe was once a year or something like that, when it got to the point where they couldn't stand it anymore. And I gave a talk in Jamestown at a German heritage weekend. And afterwards, a woman came up and said, I remember doing that for my grandmother. And I thought, that's it's a tradition then. It's not just one person's boundary. The other shawls include factory woven jacquard weave shawls. And so this isn't the best set of photos, so I apologize. But can you see the Oliver patterning with this? With a jacquard loom, every weft yarn is controlled. And so you can make, you could make a pattern that, hardly ever repeated. But that was really hard to, to program. And so there would be cards that had every yarn in action or out of action that would plop down, and if the piece of metal that controlled the heddles dropped, then that would go into action, and so the design would get laid down one thread at a time as the fabric was woven. Can you see the fleur-de-lis in the corner? And so in the big one, you can't really make that out, but in that smaller close-up, there's a little the fleur-de-lis that's on the corner. These were considered their best shawls. And so, I think women had, if they could afford it, they had a wardrobe of shawls. And their best shawls were saved for church and for ceremonies and things of that sort. And one of the things that women talk about is how their female ancestors were always buried in their best shawl, their best head shawl. Because then they were dressed and ready to see the Lord. Then here the bushka, or the floral tichle, and so these were produced and still are produced in Russia. This particular one that I took a picture of came to America in 1900, but at the same event in Ashley, a woman who was a war bride, World War II war bride, she came in the late 40s. She had the same shawl that she brought from Germany here. And I looked on I Googled Russian floral shawl, and I could buy one today with the same patterns. It's interesting. This picture that shows the two women setting down is from the Harper's Weekly magazine, and the pictures in the magazine are black and white, but these have been tinted a little bit. And so anyway, so you get to see the bright color skirt, but also the pattern of the floral tichle. They're sitting and having lunch in the shade on market day. And so it's kind of interesting to see. You see the apron, the important apron. They have boots that go up the ankle. They're a strong work boot type thing, not a tiny, skinny shoe that has a real slim foot. These women worked, and so their skirts were a little bit shorter, so they didn't drag in the mud. They wore an apron to protect the skirt, and so it's interesting to see. And the description of this, the two women were having lunch on market day, and so as you look up close, you can see the sandwiches that they're holding, and so it's interesting to think about what life would have been like on a warm day as they were sitting there. And so, the question is, how do you know how a flat textile fit around a three-dimensional body? It's a good question. I think about Indian saris, if somebody has donated that, it's so folds of fabric. But then they have a technique to wrap it and tuck it. And so photographs were really the thing that I was looking for to learn. And so the Harper's Weekly was important, but also the film that Rhea and Joseph brought. That you see the black and white. And so with this one, you see the beautiful shawl and how long that is. And if you look closely, you can see that is kind of tucked, and then the front is brought and twisted around the neck and then tied in back. And so they have very, very long fringe. Some of them, the apron's been tied over the fringe. Other times it's free. And so it's interesting to see how these folks wore that, and there's a similarity in the way that it was tied. And so somehow there's that strength of tradition. This was a film that was shot on Christmas Day, if I remember right, when they were meeting moms that were coming. They had been taken by bus to be transported instead of the ferry from Romania up into Germany. And so they were greeting these moms that had little tiny babies and were transported. And so they were dressed up for Christmas and special occasions. And so it's, excuse me, it's interesting to see how there is a continuity there, a similarity. And so is this a form of shibboleth? And so with that, it's a custom that distinguishes one group or class from another. And so, you know, I think it is. I think other people could have, you know, copied it, but yet there's this continuity within the group. And I think about, we were visiting the Mennonite colony, Mennonite people in Steinbach, and there were a lot of older women that wore little bonnets, and they had a similarity, so they probably were from the same group. There's a Hutterite colony down by where my farm is in North Dakota, and they wear black bonnets. And I sat behind them in church at a funeral. They were singing at a friend of mine's funeral. And it was interesting. They looked really similar, but some had 2 bobby pins, some had bobby pins crossed, some had 3. You know, it was fun to see how there were little variations, but yet, you know, at a quick glance, they all looked alike. But, you know, it's an example of shibboleth. They were part of the group. And so it's curious to see. And so we talked about the grooming practices, that headscarves were part of that, but they also showed modesty, especially in church. You know, I was born in 1958, and so I remember women in the Lutheran church that I went to, they would wear hats until, you know, maybe into the late 1960s, early 1970s, that began to go away. But women would cover their heads in church. And when I went to church with my Catholic friends, a lot of times women would have head coverings on them, mantillas or scarves, and so it's curious to see. There are these 3 women from the Krasna Project that they're pictured there, and I'm wondering if they are getting ready for confirmation as young women, or if there's some other celebration that they're going. The woman that's on the right-hand side, this is a picture of her at her husband's funeral, and so she has this beautiful shawl, but tied in front, and so it was a sad day for her, but she dressed the part.
Good.
And so with the shoulder shawls, I love the film from Kolilia because it showed shoulder shawls being worn, the striped shawls, and you know, I didn't really ever have a picture of people that weren't saying, well, this is how they were, you know, like a model showing how things were worn. And so with the shoulder shawls, you can see that there's snow on the ground, so there's some chill in the air. And so both of the women with striped shawls, they're carrying babies, okay? And you can see on the left, there's kind of a crease. And so one of the things that they would do is pull that under the baby, and as they brought their arm down, the baby's weight would help to hold that portion of the shawl in place. And you can see that the angle of the stripe is skewed, you know, so it's running sideways. And so what I don't know is, did it go over the shoulder here? You know, I think so. It's cold. You want your shoulder. But, you know, the right arm was the one that did most of the work. And so in the next shawl, here are 2 women. The woman that is on the right-hand side, her baby, she has her right hand up, ready to show the baby's face. And you can see the baby shown with the woman in back. And so, you know, it's curious to see how, you know, their hands are not holding and grabbing. You know, they're almost free. And so one of the things that I found kind of puzzling, and I'm still curious about this, is people would talk about how moms would be wrapping their shawls and not tying them or pinning them, but then be able to work. You know, just carrying their babies with all these tucks and folds. And, you know, I'm still really curious about that. Does anybody have anything to add about that?
People do it, like young people nowadays do it. I don't know how they do it, but I've seen them take a big piece of cloth.
Yeah.
I don't know how they do that.
Yeah, a lot of times you see a tie-in back, or a couple ties. Yeah. But yeah, it's good. And the babies stay really close. They seem really happy because they're close to mom. Yeah, it's interesting to see. Then this is a nice picture too, because the shawl that is on the right is the brightly colored shawl in this picture. So you can kind of see how it shows in black and white how the value picks up. And so it's really a wonderful piece to have in the collection because of that. Okay. Then with striped shawls, one of the things that the stripes are ubiquitous. People have them in every part of the world. Stripes, some people wear them because they're convicts, right? And so there is one theory out there that stripes are for bad people. It's like, really? And then you see, it's kind of a nautical stripe, the Braaten blouse or shirt that Pablo Picasso always wore. That was a nautical shirt, and so another variation of stripe. The women that are in the black and white photos, those are Ukrainian women, where they have striped fabrics that are worn as aprons. And with those, if you look close, you can kind of see an arrowhead type pattern that run across, so the stripes divided, but they are, divided up in a way that's different than the stripe pattern of the Black Sea German people. And so it's curious. I showed shawls that we have in our collection to students in a dress and world culture class, and there were 2 students from India, and they said that I think it was in Kerala, that there was a fabric that was made that was very similar, and I had never seen or touched it, and so the coloration was similar, the stripe pattern was similar. I don't know if the weight was, if the fiber was, and so it's interesting to see. As I took information from families, I asked, where did your family originate? And so I made use of this map. And so here's a little close-up. With the hand-woven shawls, I didn't have Maria's, or Regina District's yet, but all of the ones that I located in the 40 that I studied for my dissertation came from villages along the Kolgalik River in Bessarabia. And so, it's interesting. I know that they had sheep that were growing there. The villages were centralized, and then there were gardens and then fields that were kind of pie-shaped that radiated out from the center. And then beyond that, that's where the sheep grazed in the rough hill country. And they had ultimogeniture. They're the youngest son inherited. And so, what did the older ones do? Well, they figured it out. They had to find something else to do. So the sheep culture was one of the things. What I read is that was really not something that people liked to do, herd sheep. But yet it was something that there was a commodity, the sheep. The sheep's wool was important. The meat was important. And the milk was important. And so, those products were important for, people in the Bessarabia area, for them to make money. And so one of the things that developed in Bessarabia was a fiber processing industry. And so there were different villages that would wash wool. That was their advertisement. And so they had industrialized washing thing. So they would take the fleeces that you brought in, clean them, and get them back to you. So then you could process them further. There were other individuals that instead of having to card them by hand at home, they carded them for you. And so you get a vat of fiber that then you can spin. But then there were also people that spun, bless you. And so then they had spinning factories that would put things in the yarn. And so it's interesting to see that wool processing did develop, but the hand traditions that were part of women's domain, they continued on into this Kolgalik River area. And so it's curious to think about. But when the people that were invited from Germany to settle there, that was 1814, and they were all kind of screened. They wanted self-sufficient people, or people with trade skills that were useful for this part of the world. And so it wasn't just anybody. They looked for people that were self-sufficient. And, a self-sufficient family, that included knowledge that both the man had and the woman, the husband and the wife. And so it was an important partnership in order to provide for the family. And so, there were forces in effect, and it's interesting to think about the Industrial Revolution has had a huge impact on us. Do any of you have anything that you made that you're wearing, that you have on today? Yeah,
No, not Canadian, no.
sometimes I do, but I don't today. And so, we have a cash economy. We buy things. Somebody else makes them for us. And so, that took a long time to develop. And globalization has certainly made it easier for us, but it's interesting to see. I thought the quote about Russianizing forces were at work on German colonies. German colonies were islands within a Slavic sea in Russia, from the Schultz book. And in 1861, the Russian peasants were emancipated, and so they were freed. And so that kind of upset the social network at that time. In 1874, the privileges of the colonists were terminated, and so that changed things and really fostered a lot of outmigration, including the Homestead Act in America and whatever the equivalent was in Canada, because I know that there was something similar in Canada, and I'm sorry I didn't study that up, and I apologize. And so it's curious to think about. And so, one of the things that, as I thought about the interpretation, what does this mean? If suddenly you were supposed to be Russian instead of German, what did that do to what you wore? Would you try to fit in? If you had the money to, if you could? It's curious. I think about how a lot of times we don't even think about how there's an expectation that you brush your teeth before and wash your face before you go into public, and it's just such a part of us we don't think about that. But then so anyway we have this understanding of what life is like and what it should be like. But then when there's other pressures on it, a lot of times you have to adapt, to make it work for you. And so I'm wondering if that the Russianizing forces, if they were stronger in certain areas, like around Odessa, or maybe further, further away from Bessarabia, if that, fostered the factory-made shawl adoption. But it's interesting, all the families that had handmade shawls also had factory-made shawls. And, so they had both. And so anyway, that's a question. It's kind of fun to think about. Another thing that upset the apple cart was the displacement in World War II. And I interviewed the woman that's carried by her mom, Edith Greevely. And so her mother was carrying Edith because she had, during when they left Tarantino and started moving by wagon into, I think it was in Austria, it might have been Czechoslovakia. They got to this point with the railroad station, and they had to abandon their wagons. And at that point, then the Red Cross checked on the health of the families, the women and children, and the men. And Edith was sick. And so this is a picture of a soldier, a Nazi soldier, and a Red Cross worker escorting the mom and the baby off. And her father was a photographer, so he shot this picture. Eventually, after a few weeks, I think it was, she healed, and they moved into Germany and then on into Poland. And so it's curious to see. It served women from cradle to grave, just like textiles serve us today from cradle to grave. It's interesting to see. And so we have, the textiles that the babies were wrapped in, but also that they were buried in. And so they're part of us. We hardly even think about them, because it's just so easy to buy them. If you don't like them, give them to the thrift store and get something new. It's kind of the way that makes us happy. And at least I have to confess that somehow retail therapy makes me happy. But anyway, in just thinking about, okay, what do these shawls tell about women? Well, they certainly symbolize femininity. So shawls were associated with motherhood, with femininity, and with modesty. That was a way to show that you were respecting the traditions of the church and the community. They were part of the grooming practices. The shoulder shawls reflected women's roles as mothers in their care and the management of the family. There was a shawl that was given to us where the woman that brought it to us told about how she would be cradled by her grandmother, and the shawl would be over both of them in the evening. And so that was a good memory that she had of her grandmother, not her mother, but her grandmother. And that was, the shawls were part of the women's, the distaff side, as they say. Shawls had a long life, and so it's interesting. You know, one of the things that Nina Freilich-Wishek talked about is that a lot of German women thought that the fabric they could buy in the general stores were not very good. They weren't strong. I can't remember the German phrase, but they were just disgusted by the quality because it would fade, and you know, they were weak. And so there was this appreciation for things that were made really well. And it's interesting to see this picture of Salamina Joe, who was a midwife in the Linton community. And there's probably 40 of her grandkids. But I took a close-up of it because of her granddaughter is wearing a skirt made out of a shawl. And so, you know, she used this textile in a way that was more appropriate or useful for her. And as I looked and studied, you know, other families' things, there were kind of circles of cloth that were hand woven that looked like they were a skirt. And so it was interesting to see. And so anyway, I loved seeing this example of a shawl fabric. It wasn't a shawl anymore. But the head shawl was still being worn by the grandmother, but not the kids. So, you know, the strength of popular culture, what we call now pop culture, that had an impact on the youngsters that grew up in rural communities. You know, during this time there were musical groups that would travel around, and so you could see what other people were wearing there. You could look through catalogs or magazines. Movies were starting, and so that whole film industry thing and that way of socializing people was happening. And so it's interesting. You know, I just love that the woman with the skirt made out of the shawl fabric. She has quite the expression. It's like, she looks like she's tough. I admire her. And so with shawls, you know, the textile should last as long as possible. And it's interesting to see the bright colors that are 120, 140 years old. They're still bright. The strength of the dye stuff is still there. And people can remember women wearing the head shawls into the 1950s in North Dakota, rural areas. And then after the shawl fashions passed, they still appreciated them. And so daybed covers, some families said that this was always, after my grandmother no longer used it, she put it on the daybed when her husband came in to take a nap after lunch. Then there was a fashion to use them as a drape on their piano in the Ashley area, or fabric for skirts. Ironing board covers, that was another thing that Nina Freilich-Wishek mentioned. Quilt linings, and then also rag rugs. And so, but today they help us know about German-Russian history and a little bit more about women's lives, you know, and you know what they did to help us survive and be here today. And so anyway, so that's my formal presentation. I have to thank you all very much, but I have some show and tell. And so Maria, if you come and help me show. So there is a skirt and then two flat textiles.
So this shawl was my father's cousin, so my great cousin, who brought it from Bulgaria in Romania. And
In 1940?
it's on it. Actually, she came in the 1920s from Romania.
Okay.
That time.
Okay.
To Canada, I believe.
Yes, to Regina.
Okay. So she's been here a long time.
So yes. Saying she is gone now, but
Yeah.
her son gave it to me because he didn't know what to do with it. But as you can see, the fringes,
It's elegant, isn't it? So this was 1920.
yes.
This
So-
is handmade, right?
I'm sorry?
This is handmade.
Yes.
The
No.
fabric is machine made, but the fringe is hand tied.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why?
And tell me the name of it.
They call it Halstup. Hals is neck or throat. And because, as you saw in the photos, they would put it around and then tie it around there.
And so it has to be long. Yeah. And then, this has a nice bias, so it has a good stretch to it.
Yeah.
And it's really elegant.
And Anne's going to take this back to Fargo for the textile museum.
Oh, really nice. Thank you.
So this is long. So what would this have been?
It would have been the same shawl to carry babies. Yeah. This was my mom's. That one of the few things that she saved when they had to flee Romania. And so it's got a few worn spots at that end. But actually you can see the difference.
Yeah, it's like a little ribbon.
Yeah. Yes, no? Whoa. This you thought it was cotton.
Yeah, this one's cotton.
Yeah.
But it has a good striping pattern.
Yeah.
A little duller than the other, but
Yeah.
anyway, it's been in my trunk for forever.
Very cool.
And
Could you
Anne
put it on
wants to
three?
take this one.
Could you try to show us like these pictures?
Here, I should try it on.
Please.
Yeah.
Well, I've never had a baby, so I don't know.
Okay, I'll be out.
Well, when you asked how they would carry the babies, I think this was kind of like this, and then the baby would be in here, and then they would tuck it in.
Yeah.
That was your, yeah.
2 weeks so thing.
Stop.
Now,
Did your mom make? Did your mom?
I don't know. Either she or my grandma, because there weren't many factories in Quality. And so they would shear the sheep and wash the thing. And often they used onion for one of the guys. Yeah. And then they would spin, of course, and weave. I think there were a couple of women in the town that actually were weavers, like they had loom and that kind of thing.
Yes. I remember Joseph talking about that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's quite warm. Wonderful.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
There's the photos.
Okay.
This was my mother's skirt. She was born on December 14th, 1900 in Cornwall, Saskatchewan. And she was married in 1924. My brother was born in 1925, and he doesn't remember my mother wearing his skirt. So he thinks he's 100 years old. He's from that. It was profound.
And it was always well kept.
It was always well kept.
Yeah.
Yes, it was either flower sack material for unbleached cotton.
No big
And always hung. Nobody got to play in it.
You know,
And look at how skinny she was.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. Flowers. It does green out and mountains in there.
So is that wool or cotton?
This one is wool, and it's worth looking at. This is machine stitched trim. It's really beautiful. And if anyone likes to do handwork or fiber arts, there's a piece of midi braid, and then these are rows of variegated colored thread.
Wow.
And it creates a beautiful pattern.
A lot of work there.
Brilliant.
And it has a nice little self belt. It's really beautiful. We'll put this here so you can take a look.
Don't touch it.
Well, if you make sure your hands are clean, don't come with your dainties. Yeah, I think it's handmade. Yeah.
yes, so either my mother made it or my grandmother.
Sure. Yeah, it's really a beautiful piece.
It's lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
Well preserved.
Yeah, wonderful.
Treasure and chunk.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Question.
So thank you. If anybody has questions, I'll try to answer them. Yes,
Colors.
yes.
Is there any significance to, like, why they were doing red, blue?
You know, there's a lot of theories.
Repeat the question.
So the question was, is there a significance to why the bright colors, the reds and the blues or the greens or whatever, or the black? There are theories, there's nothing positive. I think one of the things that it points to is that there was just an aesthetic where people like bright colors. And you can see that with the shawls. I understand that houses would have brightly painted floors.
Well, yeah.
I'm not sure about walls, but floors. And if you ever been to Washington, D.C. and toured Mount Vernon, where George Washington lived, he has this bright green verdigris dining room. And so this was, what, 1760s, 1780s. Pigments, bright colors showed that you were wealthy. So there was a status element. And on the tour that I went to, they pointed to the closet up the steps where the pigments were kept locked.
Oh.
And they talked about the importance of that. So that could have played into that. But somehow there was an aesthetic preference. Another thing that people say, but in what I've seen, I haven't seen it show through, is that there's Catholics tended to like the bright reds, and Lutherans the bright blues. I have not found that. And, yeah, so, you know, and it's interesting. A cousin of mine was ordained this past summer as a Lutheran minister, and we were told to wear bright red to the ordination. So, and I should have asked, you know, why. But anyway, I can give her a call. And I can remember another cousin on a different side of the family who was married to a minister, and the practicing minister that her husband was interning with said on Reformation Sunday, you should always wear red. And that was Lutheran. So, and I know the Virgin Mary is generally in blue.
Right.
So I don't know. We can make something up. Yeah, but if anybody have thoughts on that? Yes.
No,
Or
I just had a question.
Okay.
About the dyes that were used, how color fast were those? Is it difficult to wash those without
It-
bleeding, you know?
Well, the dye process described by Nina Farley Wishick, they would grind them up, they would put them in the hot water, and they would usually use some sort of chemical like a vinegar or some other thing that served as a mordant to help open up the dye sites on the fiber. And they would use ceramic pots, and they would place the pot covered in a pile of dried manure. And that was the fuel. And it would burn for several days and just be that perfect simmering temperature, not too hot, not too cold. It would just, they keep bringing the manure close. And they would leave it in the pot for 3 days or so. So they were fast. But you also rinse after you dye things. And I'm sure that sometimes it didn't work. It depends on the water and all those things. But those colors, probably most of those things have been washed at one time, not by us, but by the wearers, and they're still bright. I can remember seeing one where there was some bleeding from one color to another, but none of the others. So they were masters. Yeah. Yes.
This is also about the colors.
Okay.
And for the first pieces that you showed at the beginning of the presentation, I think they were like late 19th century. They were the bright greens, the reds, and they were so distinctive and so similar in the color ranges, right? And then you were saying about how they came, you were saying I think they all came from Bessarabia. Was that something that you think was regional, like those particular color combinations? You mentioned about the dyes that they were sold there. Or did you see sort of other kinds, if so, did you see other kinds of color combinations associated with particular regions?
I only, you know, I didn't see other regions that had that, but the brightly colored hand-woven shawls were all on that river, that Kilgallen River
Right, yeah.
area. And one of the things that I read about the way villages were organized, there was usually a headman, and I don't remember what that person was called. And that person would almost like a mayor, the mayor of a town, but would coach people and, you know, and kind of say, you know, we have great dyers, and, you know, and they would develop an industry, and, you know, they market that then. And so, you know, I need to study that more. I don't know. But it's curious that along that river, it lasted a little bit longer. Yeah. And it's fascinating. And then with the people from Colilia, am I saying that right? Colilia. Okay, I like that better. Colilia. With you know, they originated first in Bessarabia, the Krasnok area, and then moved into Romania. So then they had that you know, knowledge that, you know, they stuck with. And so I just find it fascinating. And I wish I could kind of time travel to figure that out.
I'll just add something that our last name, Tukshera, means cloth shearer.
Okay.
And the ancestors, Dominic, I think was his name, in one of the historical accounts, is called linen man. So there's some
That's
connection,
cool.
some connection with cloth, textile.
Yeah, cloth shearer. You know, one of the things that they'll do, you know, if any of you have woven, there's little ends that stick out. And so those are things that are shorn.
Yeah.
Or if you brush, then in order to even it out, you shear. And so you might have seen pictures of people with kind of a flat shear, kind of clipping away. And then eventually that was mechanized with, you know, the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, interesting.
Should.
Yes?
I wonder if the colors that they used were just depending on the plants that were carrying and stuff. Like,
You know, I think that they had a knowledge of plant dyes, but I know that the Germans were amongst the first to have synthetic dyes,
oh, okay.
and that was coming along with this. And then the bright red, that, you know, how the cardinal red that the cardinals wear, that comes from cochineal out of Mexico, and, you know, it's a little kind of scale icky thing that lives on cactuses, and if you flick them off and squish them, there's a big streak that looks like blood came out. But anyway, they pick those things off, and then that was the bright red cochineal. And so the color of red that is shown there, that I really think that is a cochineal. You know, and you can kind of tell with a spectrometer. You know, if I had all the money in the world, yeah, you know, we could pull a few fibers off and see if they would reflect like a cochineal, or yeah, because you can identify dye stuffs. Those kind of level. Yeah, but yeah, they have, you know, they had an idea of like the onion skin, woad grew, goldenrod was a good dye stuff that, you know, just plants that grew in the area. So, and it's kind of fun to think about. And it's exciting that people are doing that now. Yes?
If they're interested in donating to the collection, what happens with it? These donations, what is going to happen to?
Okay, and so Michael was wondering about if people are interested in donating to the collection. With, you know, like the library here, you're kind of running out of room, so there's lots of things to thin out, to help yourself and bring home. You know, we have to make sure that what's donated will fit into the collection and add something to it. So there's so what we ask people to do is tell us what it is, if you can describe it, show a picture of it, tell us as much as you can about it. And then there's a committee, an acquisitions committee that looks at, you know, what's being offered and how does it fit? Do we have room for it? Can we care for it properly? Does it have a good story? And so then, you know, a decision is made that yes, we'd love to have it, or I'm sorry that we can't do that, we can't accept it. but a lot of times we'll encourage or offer other suggestions about where something could be donated. Good. How's that? I'm retired, so I don't do that anymore.
And where's this going display at?
Okay, we have the Emily Reynolds Historic Costume Collection is housed in the Family Life Center on North Dakota State University's campus. And so that's on the 4th floor of a building that has been part of the textiles and clothing area since it was built in 1974. And then the German-Russian Heritage Collection is part of the NDSU libraries, and they're in the process of remodeling. And if you come tomorrow, you'll see a diagram of how they're creating a display space. Because right now we have a lot more storage than we have display. And with textiles, you don't want to leave them out for a long time because they'll fade, or something will eat them, or they'll stretch. And so we rotate those, every 3 months to a year, or maybe even shorter if they're really dangerous, fragile. And so the new exhibit space will allow for things to be exhibited when that happens. In 2026, the German-Russian Heritage Convention, or is that, am I calling it the right thing? Anyway, it's going to be in Fargo in July. And so by then, hopefully, the display area and the heritage collection will be remodeled and ready to show. Come visit. Well, anyway, thank you. It was great.
Very nice of Ann to come out tonight and show us her videos, all the information, the colors that are just astounding. So thank you, Ann, for coming and bringing it to us. It's very nice to have you here this evening. So
Appreciate that. It's fun to be here.
that's good to hear, Joseph. Okay, so again, thank you, Ann. Ladies, you might know that Ann will be back tomorrow night. She's going to be working the computer for Mr.
Michael.
Miller. Okay, so I have another presentation tomorrow night, but it'll be a little different. Michael will be talking about Germans from Russia history, okay, which Ann covered a bit tonight as well, but anyways, it's well done. So again, thank you all for coming this evening. Please come over and have some coffee. The ladies are coming there now for some treats. And any questions, just go on your hand, or Dr. Miller, or Mr. Miller rather, and I'm sure she'll help you with this one.
Do my best.
Thank you for coming out this evening. So.
Okay, thank you.